Okay. It doesn't look like I'm displaying my video. Why is that?
We see you in your new haircut.
Oh, okay. Now you're seeing me. Well, initially that was off. Um, all right. Let's go ahead and get started. Sorry I'm a little late. I'm going to need to take a break in about 15 minutes, but it should be just a 5-minute break. I'm doing a bit too much today. I don't think you're seeing my screen yet. That's not where I want to be. Are there any questions? All right, let me, I don't need
I
that.
just want to kind of confirm, we did not have any quizzes or anything yesterday, right? We didn't have any access to seeing what was coming up this week. So I just want to make sure there wasn't a quiz that we missed.
Okay, let me share my screen. There we go. That's not helpful. So I thought I showed the schedule, when was it, 2 days ago? And we're covering chapter 14 today. There is no quiz this week. The next quiz will be March 3rd, I believe. It's Wednesday of week 9. We are 8 weeks into the term, so hopefully you guys are feeling good and getting ready to end. Um, we only have 2 more weeks of lecture, and then we'll have a third week with the final. The final will be due at 11:59 p.m. Wednesday, March 17th. And I talked about that having heavy coverage of the chapters since this quiz, the last quiz is covering chapter 8 and lab 9. It is not covering lab 8. So lab 8 isn't going to be covered except in the final, and that is because lab 8 was added, I think I added it the first time last term. And so the quizzes were designed before the lab was added. Any questions about that? All
No,
right, so that's what we're doing. Um, Today in the lab, I am going to be there to answer questions, but we have no lab that we are doing. So I'll be there from 6:30 to 6:45. At 6:45, if there are not any questions, I'm going to log off. Okay? All right, any questions about what we're doing? So chapter 14, principles of disease. Let's see where we were. So we had discussed this slide talking about communicable, contagious, and non-communicable diseases. Is that correct?
yes. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the occurrence of a disease. To understand the full scope of a disease, we need the details about its occurrence. I gotta get that someplace where it doesn't interfere. The occurrence of diseases. The incidence is the fraction of a population that contracts a disease during a specific time. And what this means is that the incidence is taking into account only the new cases. The prevalence is the fraction of a population having a specific disease at a given time, and the prevalence includes the new cases and the old cases. An example of that, in the United States in 2007, we had an incidence of 56,300 new cases, but the prevalence was 1,185,000. Is that clear? So prevalence is both new and old cases. The incidence are only the new cases. And you kind of have to find out what do they mean by new cases. In this case, they're saying in 2007, for the entire year, there were 56,300 cases that were new in that year. Maybe that will work better. So let's talk a little bit about the occurrence of disease. Sporadic diseases are diseases that occur only occasionally in a population. Like most people consider typhoid fever a sporadic disease in the United States. It doesn't happen very often, and it's sporadic. An endemic disease is a disease that is constantly present in a population. Like the common cold is endemic to the United States and probably everywhere in the world. Malaria is endemic to the tropics. Any question about that? An epidemic is a disease that is acquired by many hosts in a given region at a given time. So an epidemic that we're facing right now is COVID-19. We have many more cases than we've had in the past, and of course it's a new disease, so that's the case. And you'd say it's an epidemic in the United States or in North America. Pandemic is a worldwide disease that is acquired by many hosts in a given short period of time. So COVID-19 is now a pandemic. Initially, it was an epidemic in China, but then the disease spread beyond China. And once it became worldwide, generally 2 or more continents make it pandemic. Influenza, when we have an epidemic of it, it quickly becomes pandemic. But you got to remember that when we're talking about an epidemic, that means statistically more than the normal cases. And I don't think this year we're having an epidemic in the United States of influenza. But I'd have to go look because I'm not positive. I think the cases of influenza worldwide are down because people are taking COVID-19 precautions, and that's reducing the spread of communicable diseases, especially the contagious diseases. Any question about any of that? Now, when you're talking about a sporadic disease, it is, because they don't happen very often, it is arguable what is a low incidence endemic disease and what is a sporadic disease. And so people will argue about that. We're not going to get into that argument. Like some people say that TB is endemic to the United States at low numbers because the homeless population and other groups tend to have it. Other people say, no, it's a sporadic disease. It only happens occasionally in the United States. And we're not going to get into that argument. When you're talking about diseases that happen at low numbers, it's not real clear-cut where that disease falls, like TB. Okay? Any question about any of that? Let's take a look at the severity or duration of a disease. That's another useful way of defining the scope of disease, is in terms of its severity or its duration. We have acute diseases, and these are diseases where the symptoms develop rapidly and they're short-lived. Can anyone name an acute disease?
Food poisoning?
Yeah, Usually food poisoning is short-lived. It isn't always short-lived, but usually it is. I was going to say a better one would be the common cold. It hits you very rapidly, it develops its symptoms rather rapidly, and then it goes away very rapidly. So it is an acute disease. A chronic disease is a disease that develops slowly and persists for long periods of time. An example of a chronic disease is mononucleosis, hepatitis B, and if you talk about, somebody who plays tennis, maybe tennis elbow, that's a non-contagious disease, but it's a chronic disease. It develops slowly, persists for a long period of time, and actually with that one, tennis elbow, it never gets better while you're playing tennis. Okay? Now there are diseases in between an acute disease and a chronic disease. I'm not going to test you on it. We'll just mention a subacute disease. It's in between an acute disease and a chronic disease. And most of you have probably never heard of subacute sclerosing panencephalitis. That would be an example of a subacute disease. Any question about any of those? The extent of host involvement in disease. Infections can also be classified according to the extent to which the host body is affected by the disease. A local infection is where the pathogens are limited to a small area of the body, usually an initial infection site. A boil on the skin is a local infection. An abscess on the skin or in the throat or in the mouth is a local infection. A systemic or generalized infection is an infection throughout the body. An example would be measles, where the infection, actually that one is breathed in, it then gets in the bloodstream spreads it throughout the body, and we see it usually by the lesions on the skin, but it goes throughout the body because it's carried through the blood. Any disease which is carried by the blood is considered a systemic infection. A focal infection is a systemic infection that began as a local infection, like MRSA. When it spreads from the skin, it moves and infects the blood. That would be a focal infection.
What's a focal infection that didn't start off as a local infection?
All focal infections, and generally all systemic infections, start out as a local infection. Because usually you have it developing in one place in your body, and then it gets into the bloodstream or the lymphatics, and then it's spread throughout the body. The only exception to that would be maybe like if you get a blood transfusion, that doesn't really have a local infection. Meaning you get the disease through a blood transfusion. Then it starts as a systemic infection. I don't think there is a disease that starts as a focal infection. I can't think of any off the top of my head. That they all start as a local and then become a focal. Most diseases do start as local and then become systemic, but there are some exceptions. All right, are there any questions about that? If there's no questions about it, I need to take about a 5-minute break. We'll be back at 5:25. Okay? So take a 5-minute break. I'm going to leave the connection open. You'll see me return. Okay, I'm back. Any questions? Hello? All right, let's begin. So the extent of the host involvement. Bacteremia is the presence of bacteria in the blood. This compares with septicemia, which is the growth of bacteria in the blood. So septicemia just means the bacteria are there and growing. If the bacteria are there, it's bacteremia. Any questions about that? Toxemia is the presence of toxins in the blood. Viremia is the presence of viruses in the blood. This is the start of the in-class activity, so I'll go through it very quickly. The extent of host involvement. The state of the host resistance determines the extent of an infection. A primary infection is acute infection that causes the initial illness, like when you first breathe in tuberculosis and you have tuberculosis in your lungs. That would be the primary infection. Now usually, oops, I lost my mouse. Usually tuberculosis doesn't go beyond the lungs and it becomes limited, but it can, especially in the elderly, start moving beyond the lungs, coming out of its, what do they call that? The stasis, where the host keeps it maintained but doesn't throw it off, and the host disease balance. And it breaks that balance and then infects the blood and then can be carried to the blood to other tissues besides the blood and the lungs. Any question about that? Secondary infection is when the primary infection weakens the area, and so an opportunistic disease can come in and give the secondary infection. You might see this with children where they have a sore throat, which can be either caused by a viral or bacterial pathogen, and then they get an earache as a secondary infection. That the primary infection weakened the host immune system, weakened the host defenses, and then the opportunistic disease can move in. A subclinical disease is a disease that has no noticeable signs and symptoms, an inapparent infection. Now, I've been using the term asymptomatic disease, but another term for that is subclinical disease. Some people can carry the polio virus but never get polio. How about COVID-19? Can people be subclinical, have a subclinical disease of COVID-19, no signs or symptoms?
Yes.
Yeah, if you're talking about young people, and that's most of you guys, it's actually up to 50% of you can have a subclinical infection. A latent disease is a disease where the disease-causing organism goes latent or stops causing disease and just hides out. The patient has a period with no symptoms. The pathogen is inactive. An example of that is shingles, where usually a child gets, it's not smallpox, chickenpox, okay? And they have a disease, and then it goes latent. And it may go latent for decades. And then usually when the child is grown up and is an elderly individual, the patient can get shingles. Cold sores is another example where you get your initial cold sore and it goes away, and then maybe a year or two later you get another cold sore. Usually the cold sore happens in about the same location as the first initial infection. Like my first cold sore must have been on my gum, because that's the back part of my gum. That's the last part. That's the place where I get cold sores the most. But it can come out in another place. Anyways, those are two examples of a latent disease, where it hides out, not causing disease, and then some point later in time it does come back and cause disease. Any question about latent diseases? Fortunately, there aren't too many diseases that are latent. Herd immunity is when many immune people are in a population, and then the many immune people prevent the disease from spreading in the population. They're asking about how long will it be before COVID-19 becomes herd immunity, so it will no longer spread in the population. We will need 80% of the population to be either infected or have the vaccine before the population will become immune to COVID-19. Sorry, I keep putting that in the wrong place. There, it goes there. So here we have no immunity in the population, and this happened with COVID-19. And then when one individual gets it, everyone in contact with gets it, and then who they're in contact with gets it, and then it just spreads to the majority of the people in the population. Now, if you have lots of immune people, the yellow people in the population, let's see if I can blow that up a little. And then when somebody gets sick, the non-immune people who are blue are largely protected. You have to be in close contact with the sick individual before you will become infected. And then the disease doesn't spread further because everyone that they're in contact with are immune to it. Some diseases require a very high percentage of the population to be immune to it before the disease will spread. Like I said, COVID-19, it's estimated that about 80%, maybe as high as 85% of the population will have to be immune to it before that disease will stop spreading. Another disease which is highly contagious, and you need 95% of the population to be immune before the disease stops spreading, is measles, a childhood disease. And not enough people get vaccinated or have their children vaccinated for the measles. So every once in a while, we have an outbreak or an epidemic of the measles because people say, that disease isn't going around very much anymore. I don't like immunization. I'm not going to get my child immunized. And then they're at risk for getting the disease because measles has to have a very high percentage of the population to be immune, or else it'll spread. I remember there was a big outbreak happening at Disney World among children because not enough children were immune to the measles. And so a lot of the children that went to Disney World were spreading the disease and picking it up. Any question about any of that? If not, let's move on to the patterns of disease. Normally, disease follows a specific sequence of events associated with the infection. And that's because of the microbe and the host, so that the disease follows a specific pattern of disease. First, there has to be a reservoir existing for the disease to come from, and then infect in a susceptible host. The pathogen must be transmitted to a susceptible host in some manner, like with malaria. A susceptible host, the disease is transmitted by mosquitoes. The pathogen then has to invade the host and multiply in the host, and the pathogen has to injure the host. If you have no injury of the host, you will have an asymptomatic or subclinical disease. And that's still a disease, but no injury of the host, you have no signs or symptoms of the disease. The disease ends when the host immune system destroys the pathogen or when the host dies. That's when the disease will end. Any question about any of that? There are a number of predisposing factors that can make an individual more susceptible to coming down with the disease. And that will affect the occurrence of a disease in a population. For example, females have a shorter urethra than males, so they have a higher incidence of bladder infection. Individuals who carry the sickle cell gene are weakened, their immune system, so they're more likely to come down with other infections. The climate and the weather can predispose people to getting an infection, making the disease more common. And that's why in the wintertime, usually, people are more likely to come down with the colds and the flus. They can spread at other times of the year, but like during the summer, the intense sunlight especially kills colds and flus. And it's the UV rays of the sun that kill the virus, as well as the weather. It turns out that with some cold viruses and the influenza, the colder weather makes the virus live longer, and that's one reason why colds and flus are more likely to spread in the winter. Another reason is, of course, that people are more likely to be indoor, so they're more likely to be around other people, and then the virus gets in the home, it's more likely to spread in the home because people don't have their windows open. Okay, so that's all true, but it's also true that there's less UV light from the sun in the wintertime, and it's a cooler temperature. So imagine somebody sneezes on your coat. The influenza virus is likely to survive at cool temperatures, and then when you get into your home several hours later and you take off your coat, you can pick up the influenza virus, and it's still alive, and then you inoculate yourself with the virus. Whereas in the summertime, assuming you're wearing a coat in the summertime, they sneeze on your coat. Well, the strong sunlight, both the UV rays and then the increased temperature, will kill off the virus. And then when you take off your coat or your cloak, whatever, when you get home, the virus will be dead, and so you won't come down with influenza. All right, so that's how climate and the weather can affect people getting a disease. Fatigue also makes people more likely to come down with an infection. It, especially if you're fatigued, weakens your host immune system, making you more likely to come down with an infection. And students are frequently fatigued, so you guys are more risk for getting an infection. Age also is a predisposing factor to coming down with a disease. I think everybody knows the older you are, the more likely you are to die from COVID-19. And that's true also for coming down with a disease. For one thing, the older you are, the weaker your immune system, and so the more likely you are to get the disease. Lifestyle can affect your chance for coming down with the disease. Most people know that people who smoke, it damages the mucosa of the respiratory system, and that can open up spaces and allow another infection to come in and cause disease. And other lifestyle can increase your risk too, like if you party all the time and go out to very large parties, you're going to be at more risk for coming down with a disease because you're being exposed to more people. And if you're partying all the time, you're going to be fatigued and your immune system's going to be weak. Chemotherapy weakens your immune system, and so that makes you more likely to come down with the disease. Any question about these factors predisposing you to coming down with the disease? All right, I don't hear any questions, so let's move on to the development of disease. Diseases tend to follow, almost all of them, the same development of disease. And it's certainly true for any one disease. It follows the same development of the disease. Once the host defenses are breached, disease follows a certain sequence. And this is true for acute and chronic diseases, such as the cold, an acute disease. And obviously colds and flus I'll be talking about with this, but also for like mononucleosis. They tend to follow similar cases of the development of disease. All diseases start with an incubation period. That is where the time in between when the patient first becomes infected with the disease-causing agent till the times that they have signs or symptoms. So that's the incubation period. The incubation period length will depend on the disease. Some of them are fairly short, like colds tend to be about 3 to 5 days. I think COVID-19 is 4 days to 2 weeks. And other diseases can be very lengthy. Trying to remember where the flesh rots away. What the heck is that called? Known since biblical times. You don't know what disease I'm talking about? Where you get a skin infection and then it just spreads throughout the body.
Leprosy.
Leprosy, thank you. I knew it was a mycobacterium, but I couldn't remember what the heck the second word was. Leprosy. And it tends to follow the same sequence, even though the incubation period is quite lengthy. It could be weeks after being exposed to it. I don't know the upper length there, but it could be maybe even a few months after being exposed to it, you come down with leprosy. It doesn't happen in just 3 days, is my point. Anyways, the incubation period is followed by the prodromal period. That's when the patient first comes down with mild signs or symptoms. So when you first come down with a sore throat and you say, geez, do I have a sore throat? And you have to think about it. And then you say, yeah, I've got a sore throat. I must be coming down with something. That's the prodromal period, where the initial signs and symptoms are very mild. And then that's followed by the period of illness, where you don't have to think about, do I have a sore throat? You've got a burning sore throat, and that's the period of illness, where the signs and the symptoms are most severe. Generally, on this chart here, the sign or symptoms are increasing with the y-axis. It's also the number of microbes are increasing on the y-axis. And then on the x-axis is the time. Eventually, the first patient may get better, and then they leave the period of illness, and we have the period of decline. If you have a fever in your period of illness, and then the fever breaks, that would be the start of the period of decline. With the sore throat and the cold, your runny nose, instead of being a constant thin runny nose, you have a slower, thicker runny nose, but you start feeling a little better and your nose is running less often. That would be the period of decline, where the signs and symptoms start getting better. Okay? And that's followed by the period of convalescence, where the patient still has the disease-causing organisms, but the number of disease-causing microbes is below a threshold now, and so this patient has no signs or symptoms, but they still have the disease-causing organism. And that's the period of convalescence. So most diseases follow this development of disease. They don't always have every stage. For example, when I've had the flu, sometimes I'm doing really fine, and then the next moment it's like somebody hit me over the head with a sledgehammer. Has anyone ever experienced that? No comments, so maybe I'm the only one. The point is sometimes with the flu, there is no prodromal period. You go from the incubation period directly to the period of illness. And then for some diseases, there is no period of decline. If the patient never gets better and dies, there is no period of decline, there is no period of convalescence.
And why it goes so fast?
Well, that could be a patient who comes down with the flu, and then the flu kills them. Okay? The same thing with COVID-19. The patient gets COVID-19 and then they die, so they never get a period of decline. They never get a period of convalescence. The illness kills them. It used to be when a patient got HIV and then they got AIDS, it used to be it never had a period of decline. Nowadays, with modern therapy, the patient can enter a period of decline. I don't think, though, there have been many cases where the patient ever became disease-free with HIV. There have been, like I said, maybe a handful of cases where they think the patient may be disease-free, but the trouble is HIV can integrate into your DNA, and so it could come out many years later. But most people, they might even enter a period of convalescence, but they still have the disease. Okay, so AIDS doesn't automatically kill everyone nowadays, but it used to when it first came out. It used to kill everyone. All right, any question about the development of disease and the 5 periods of disease? No questions? Then here's a question for you. Which period of disease are you not communicable, where you cannot spread the disease to other people?
The convalescence period?
Convalescence was a guess. Anybody else?
The period of decline?
Yeah.
Period of decline. Okay, those are good guesses. No. Actually, if you notice here, you have number of microbes every time from the incubation period till the end of the period of convalescence. And so you can pass on disease during every period of a disease, including the period of convalescence where you have no signs or symptoms. Of course, in the incubation period, you have no signs or symptoms. My mother used to tell me, "Oh, I'm getting better. I'm no longer contagious." And I would say, "Mom, you're talking to a microbiology instructor. I know better. You still can give the disease." It's not until the period of convalescence ends, and that ends when you no longer have the disease-causing organism in you, that you can no longer spread disease. And that was a trick question. I will never ask a question like that in an exam. But my point is, you can pass on a disease during every period of disease. For the common diseases like colds and flus, and I'm talking about for adults, not for children, you're most likely to spread that disease late in the incubation period or in the prodromal period. And that's a little surprising because you have less disease organisms in these 2 periods than you do in the period of illness. But for an adult, the immune system ramps up, and they are less contagious in the period of illness than they are in the prodromal period and late in the incubation period. Okay, early in the incubation period, you may not be spreading disease. We're not going to get into that. Like for COVID-19, you have to be carrying it for 4 days before you're contagious. Any question about that? I think what's happening is that in evolution, parents didn't want to spread their colds and flus to their children, and so their immune system ramped up, and it made them less contagious in the period of illness than in the incubation period and the prodromal period. These 2 periods, the immune system doesn't have enough time to respond to the disease. And usually the reason why you enter the period of decline is because of the immune system. All right, let's talk about the spread of infection. Before a disease can infect a patient, it has to come from a reservoir of infection. A reservoir is a continual source of the disease organism. A reservoir can be living or non-living. Other humans are reservoirs for human diseases. And some diseases only have human reservoirs, like AIDS can only be transmitted from other humans. Gonorrhea can only come from another human. Sometimes carriers may have inapparent infections or a latent disease, in which case you don't know that they have it and that they can spread it to you. Any question about that? So one big reservoir of human disease are other humans. And that's certainly true for any disease that we only get from humans, like AIDS and gonorrhea. It is possible that one of the chimps can carry AIDS, but because of the way AIDS spreads, it'd be very unlikely that that would spread to another human. Other animals can be reservoirs for some diseases, like most cases of rabies and Lyme diseases come from an animal reservoir. Some diseases are diseases of animals, but they can spread to human, and these we call zoonoses, animal diseases that may be spread to humans. The table 2 in your textbook discusses some zoonoses. Can anyone mention a zoonoses? Nobody can mention a zoonoses. Well, malaria we get from mosquitoes, and that virus can live in humans and in mosquitoes. Obviously, rabies was an example. What's another example?
Ringworm?
Well, say again?
Ringworm?
Ringworm can come from an animal. It can come from a human, too.
Bird flu?
Say again? I didn't hear that.
Bird flu?
Bird flu. Oh, yeah, that's an animal reservoir. Very good one there. There are also non-living reservoirs. Some diseases spread from non-living reservoirs, like botulism and tetanus. It's very unlikely that you would ever catch botulism and tetanus from another person, assuming that you're not a cannibal. Okay? And if you are a cannibal, you should cook the human, and that way you wouldn't get botulism and tetanus. That's a joke, people. Nobody's laughing. Common non-living reservoirs can be the soil, water, lettuce. Like if you have a cat and he goes to the bathroom in your garden, and then the wind blows the, what is that? Disease coming from cats. Sorry, I'm drawing a blank here.
Plasmosis.
Yeah, plasmosis, thank you. The wind blows the plasmosis cyst from the soil onto the lettuce or your radishes or your carrots, and then you bring them in from your garden. You can get it from a non-living reservoir. And we include lettuce and carrots from the garden as non-living because once you pick them, they're going to die. Okay? When they're out in the garden, they're still a living reservoir, but once you pick them, they're now a non-living reservoir. And a lot of diseases come from non-living reservoirs, like E. coli infection, when people mostly get it from eating contaminated water or drinks, especially that, or uncooked foods like lettuce or vegetables from the garden. That can spread E. coli from a non-living reservoir. Let's move on to the transmission of disease, how disease spreads from one location to another or one patient to another. There are three principal routes which the causative agent of disease can be transmitted from the reservoir infection to a susceptible host. And these three principal routes are contact transmission. Direct contact is an example of contact transmission. Vehicle transmission, where something brings the disease to the healthy person so they become infected. And then vector transmission, where an animal or something living brings the disease to the healthy person so they become infected. So a vehicle is an object bringing the disease, and a vector is an animal. Like generally people get rabies from a vector, but if you touch a pencil and you pick up a cold or flu from the pencil was an object bringing the disease to you, so that's a vehicle. Any question about that? Okay, contact transmission has three different types. There's direct contact transmission, and that's person-to-person transmission. It requires close association between the infected individual and the susceptible host. An example of that would be a handshake. Somebody blows their nose and they don't wash their hands or sanitize their hand, and then you give a handshake. Kissing, spreading disease that way. Direct person to person. Indirect would be where the spread from the reservoir to a susceptible host via a non-living fomite occurs, and a fomite is just a non-living object. And fomite is a term you need to know. It just means a non-living object. For example, if somebody is sick and then they touch money and then they pay for the money at the store, and then the store gives you back change and they give you back that money that's contaminated. The money was the fomite spreading indirectly the disease to you. Any question about that? The third contact transmission is droplet, where transmission occurs via an airborne droplet that travels less than 1 meter. This is different from airborne transmission, which is not contact transmission. And we have a slide here. Direct transmission, hand to hand. Droplet transmission, when somebody sneezes and it travels less than 1 meter, that's 3 feet. And that would be from here to here. And then indirect transmission is when somebody touches the baseball and they put the disease-causing organism on the baseball, and then the catcher touches the baseball and then with this hand throws the baseball to the pitcher, and then he scratches his nose or mouth with this hand and then infects himself indirectly from the baseball. Any question about any of that? The reason why I'm not going to test you on droplet transmission, and that is it's just a little bit too much subjective, and that is this region here would be droplet transmission and contact transmission. This region here to there would not be droplet transmission and would not be contact transmission, and that's why I'm not going to test you on droplet transmission. It's just, to me, a little bit too arbitrary. It's both the transmission is coming from a sneeze, and I would say that you get it from the sneeze regardless of whether it's within 3 meters, or is it 3 feet? Yeah, 1 meter, 3 feet, sorry. 1 meter or 3 feet, as opposed to beyond that. Okay? The next way that transmission can happen is vehicle transmission, where transmission is transmitted by an inanimate reservoir, and this can be fluid, water, bodily fluids. There are 3 types of vehicle transmission. Waterborne transmission, such as when the disease comes to you by contamination by sewage that has contaminated the drinking water. Foodborne transmission, where, I don't know, the server grabs the plate of food and then carries it to your table, and before they put it down on your table, they sneeze, and then you eat the food. That would be foodborne transmission. Airborne transmission is when the droplet travels more than 1 meter from the infected person to the host, and so that would be this region right here. And I'm not going to test you on airborne transmission because it's a vehicle transmission. It happens beyond 3 feet, whereas droplet transmission is before 3 feet or 2, 3 feet, and it's contact transmission. And like I said, that's a little too arbitrary for my taste, so I won't test you on that. I will test you on that you can get it from a sneeze, okay? All right, any question about that? Vector transmission is where an animal picks up the disease or carries the disease and then brings it to a susceptible host. The most important group of vectors are arthropods, especially fleas, ticks, and mosquitoes, bringing disease to a person. They can transmit disease in 2 ways. Mechanical transmission, it's passive transport, like the fly is passively transporting the disease-causing organism by picking it up on his feet and then landing on the food, putting the disease-causing organism on the food, which is then consumed, and then the patient gets the disease-causing organism by mechanical transmission of a fly, which is a vector. Any question about that? That differs from biological transmission, where the pathogen can reproduce inside the vector. Malaria is an example of a biological transmission. The mosquito picks up the malaria parasite. The malaria parasite grows within the mosquito. And then the mosquito bites another person, and that will be biological transmission by the mosquito, which is a vector. Any question about any of these? If not, let's move on to nosocomial infections. This is also called hospital-acquired infection or health-acquired infection. This is a very important topic for you guys, maybe the most important one for you, because many of you will be working in a healthcare facility. And so you should know about nosocomial infections and how to prevent them. Any question about any of that? Nosocomial infections, also called hospital-acquired infections, are those infections that are acquired by a patient from a result of the hospital stay. The infection was not present or incubating in the patient at the time of admission. They get the hospital-acquired infection because they're staying in the hospital or the healthcare facility. It's estimated that between 5 to 15% of hospital patients acquire a nosocomial infection because they went into the healthcare setting. That is, in the United States, 2 million people per year, and then 20,000 people in the United States die each year of a nosocomial infection. In the United States, and it's important because it's the 8th leading death in the United States. Nosocomial infections occur in about greater than 1 in 20 hospital patients. Like I said before, 5 to 15% of hospital patients come down with a nosocomial infection. 50% of nosocomial infections are preventable. You can take steps to prevent their spread. And of course, it's a major cost and healthcare problem. I'm not going to talk about that, just know it's a major thing. Nosocomial infections result from the interaction of three factors. First, microorganisms are in the hospital environment. That's unavoidable. Hospitals are major reservoirs of sick people, and these sick people have nosocomial agents. There's nothing we can do about that. That's what we have hospitals for. Some normal microbiota are opportunistic pathogens, and they can become nosocomial infective agents. And then, of course, some nosocomial pathogens are antibiotic resistant, and then that will be a health problem for the patient who gets it. All right, so microorganisms are in the hospital environment. That's one reason why we have nosocomial infections. The other thing is, too, the patient comes into the hospital for a reason. They are compromised hosts. One whose resistance to infection is impaired by disease, therapy, or burn. The patient is in the hospital for a reason, and that makes them more susceptible to coming down with a nosocomial infection. They may have broken skin or a broken mucous membrane, making the patient more susceptible. Examples: a burn patient, simply an injection that puts a hole in your skin, ventilators, urinary catheters, the administration of anesthesia, all weaken the host immune system and the host defenses, like the burn and the injections make a hole in the skin so the pathogen can get in. Some people have a suppressed immune system which compromises the host. That could be patients taking certain drugs. Chemotherapy and radiation therapy patients have a weakened immune system. And then burn patients also have a weakened immune system, as well as weakened skin. And that can make them more susceptible to coming down with a nosocomial infection. There's a chain of transmission of nosocomial infective agents in the hospital. The principal routes of transmission can be direct contact transmission, such as patient to patient, or staff to patient, such as when a patient is in a special care unit, and then the hospital staff administers to that patient, and then they immediately go and administer to another patient. Once you touch a patient, you should sterilize your hands after touching that patient before touching another patient, or taking off those gloves and putting on fresh gloves. Any question about that? There can be indirect transmission, where the transmission happens via a fomite. That could be a urinary or a IV catheter, contaminated surgical dressing. You should only use fresh urinary and IV catheters and uncontaminated surgical dressings. Okay? Indirect transmission could be, like I said, somebody sneezes and they touch a doorknob or a light switch, and then the patient, I don't know, goes walking around, and then they come into their room and they touch the doorknob or the light switch, and then they pick it up by indirect transmission. And then vehicle airborne transmission happening via the ventilation system. Now that would be for respiratory infective agents. Sometimes patients pick up colds and flu or diseases like that because they're airborne and the ventilation system can spread it. This is particularly a problem on an airplane because the airplane is a closed ecosystem, And if anybody is sick on that plane, their airborne microbes are stuck on that plane and they just recirculate on the plane. And that is a problem with planes. And surprisingly, the airline industry has not done anything to control that, because COVID-19 transmission on an airplane is a real problem. The airlines have known about this for almost 50 years now, and they don't want to do anything because it adds cost to the airplane ticket. A simple way of doing it would be simply to take all the air and send it under a UV light before you recirculate it to the patients, and that really wouldn't be that expensive. You just need a certain region to do that, and I guess maybe you'd have to change the design of the airplane, but like I said, that's something they need to work on, the vehicle airborne transmission of a disease in an airplane. Okay, let's briefly talk about ways to control nosocomial infections. Certain procedures are generally implemented to control nosocomial infections. First, use aseptic technique always when you're handling other specimens, meaning a contaminated specimen. Always use aseptic technique, and then you will be unlikely to spread the disease-causing microbes. You're learning aseptic technique in microbiology. Take it and use it when you go and work in a healthcare facility. Use proper handling of contaminated materials, and that's sort of in hand with aseptic technique. Another thing to do is frequent and thorough hand washing. It's been shown that if the staff in the hospital have frequent and thorough hand washing, and the visitors also, that they can reduce nosocomial infective agents by 50%. We need to educate the staff, the patient, and the visitors of a hospital to the dangers of nosocomial infections and what they can do to prevent the spread of them. And the hospitals have gotten very good now. They usually have signs up in the elevator and on the floors, and then they have sanitizers all over the place, like right before the room going into the patient, on the elevator. And if visitors do that, the staff does that, and the patients do that, we'll have much less spread of nosocomial infective agents. There's other things you can do to reduce the spread of nosocomial infective agents, and I'm going to refer you to the textbook and the online chapter notes for what you can do. The main one, as I said, is simply frequent and thorough hand washing, especially between patients, serving one patient to another patient. All right, we're almost finished here. We might be able to finish this lesson. Epidemiology. Any questions about nosocomial infective agents? Because if there's no questions, I'm going to move on to epidemiology. All right, I'm not hearing anything, so let's move on to epidemiology. Epidemiology, the study of where and when diseases occur and how they're transmitted in populations. The CDC collects and analyzes U.S. epidemiological information. Usually, the healthcare facilities, like the doctors and the clinic offices, send that into the local authorities, the local counties. The county sends it into the state, and then the state forwards it to the CDC. The CDC then publishes that in the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, which is usually abbreviated MMWR, and you can find that at www.cdc.gov. They publish that every week. Notifiable diseases are diseases that physicians are required by law to report to the local authorities and eventually to the CDC. the CDC collects it. Okay? Any question about any of that?
No.
All right. Morbidity is the incidence of a specific notifiable disease. The morbidity rate, the number of people affected in relation to the total population in a given time period. So morbidity, the incidence of that specific disease. Mortality is the deaths from a notifiable disease. The mortality rate, the number of deaths from a disease in relation to the population in a given time. Mortality is usually published in a year. So we talk about the mortality rate of the individuals in the year. But sometimes mortality is given for the total number of patients, like the number of COVID-19 deaths in the United States has gone past 500 million people in the United States who have died now from COVID-19. And that's the total number of people. But this disease has been around for about 1 year now. I think slightly over a year if we're looking at China, but in the United States, the most it's been around is about 1 year. And we've had over 500,000 deaths as our mortality rate. All right, any questions about epidemiology? If not, we finish this lesson, and I'll see you in the lab at 6:30 if you have questions. If you don't have questions, you don't need to come to the lab. And if you have questions, make sure you come between 6:30 and 6:45, because if there's no questions, I'll log off at 6:45. All right?